All right, we are in Genesis chapter 16. Genesis chapter 16. Have you ever had a big enough problem that you had to kind of go away somewhere and just think? Just somewhere else. A place of quiet, a place of rest. Couldn't really do it at home, couldn't really be around other people. You just had to get away. Yeah? Everyone? Some? Yeah, I haven't found a place here yet because I haven't needed to look, so that's nice. But but each place that we've lived, I can remember the spot that I would go because it's an important spot to be able to go, just to seek God's will and direction and just to be refreshed and renewed. That's what we're going to see Hagar do here in this chapter in a little bit. I'm going to read the whole chapter, Genesis 16, starting in verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go unto my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." And Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She said, "I am fleeing from my mistress, Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen." So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." For she said, "Truly here I have seen him who looks after me." Therefore the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So what stands out to you in this chapter? Yeah.
Seems like the man's always at fault.
Seems like the man's always at fault. May it seem like it, right?
He said it was his fault. Who started the conversation?
Yeah, Sarai said that it was Abram's fault. Who started the conversation, Dennis said. What else stands out?
Once she was pregnant, right? She looked with contempt.
Yeah, once she was pregnant. Yep. Once she was pregnant, Gracia said she looked with contempt on Sarai, which makes sense.
It also goes to prove if you have two wives, you've got trouble.
Yeah. If you have two wives, you've got trouble. Yeah. Those are good things that stood out. Yep, for sure. Anything else? Jealousy. Yeah. I mean, on full display here, right?
They took something into their own hands. God told them that he was going to give them a son, and she was the one, not Abraham. It was Sarai.
Uh-huh. Yep.
Decided to.
Yeah. Gracia said that she took things into her own hands, and she was the one who decided, not God, not Abraham, to take things into her hands.
They weren't patient.
They weren't patient.
Well, they were 86.
Yeah, but still, God told them.
Yep. Other things? Anything else? What do we learn about faith in this chapter? Huh? I didn't hear you. Lack of faith here. Yep. Lack of it. Definitely. Well, verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. Okay, so Abram was 85 years old at this point. He'd been walking with the Lord for 10 years after God had called him out of the land of Ur. Yeah, sometimes I have to remember these things, I tell you. God had promised Abram and Sarai a child, but had not told them when that child would be born. It was a period of waiting. Most people don't like to wait on things, especially today. But Hebrews 6 verse 12 says that it is through faith and patience that we inherit the promises. Faith and patience that we inherit the promises. So we see in verse 1 two different things. One, Sarai had no children, and secondly, Sarai had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. Now remember that this slave came from the time when they were in Egypt, so nothing good comes from their time in Egypt. But Sarai was impatient. See if I can keep this page down. Nope. Give me a hymnal. Gracias. That'll work. Sarai was impatient. She knew she was physically incapable of having children, but that her husband was still capable of it. And God had specifically named Abram as the father of all his offspring, but he had not yet identified the mother. He had said nothing yet about Sarai. So logically for her, logically it would be her, but Sarai was just kind of second-guessing God here. So in verse 2, we come into verse 2, and Sarai says, it may be that I shall obtain children by her. So it may be that it's Hagar who is supposed to have the covenant child. She's very self-focused here, though. She's been prevented from having children. She has a slave. She shall obtain children through her slave. So it's all kind of about Sarai and less about the promise of Abram. And now what she's suggesting to Abram was just know that it was actually perfectly legal during their day. It was the custom of those days for the wife to give her slave to her husband as a secondary wife in the hope that there would be offspring. In fact, Rachel and Leah would do the same thing for Jacob in the future. That's how we get the 12 tribes of Israel, is through 4 different women. But here, Abraham had faith in God, but he kind of takes matters into his own hands too. Now, Sarai's suggestion may have looked like self-denial or maybe even noble, right? Sacrificing her standing to allow Abram to have offspring. So he may not have realized right away that this was kind of acting against faith and trying to act in their own strength. But ultimately, Abram and Sarai did wrong here, right? They should have waited for God. But they attempted to secure their promise in their own strength. They acted only to please themselves and really not to glorify God. They wanted to have it in their time and in their way. They were not obeying Him, nor were they waiting on Him. Abram can be an example of us, can he? We can sometimes have hard time waiting on God. We want to take things into our own hands and just have things happen on our own timetable too. Right? I'm not the only one. Hopefully not. Let's look at verses 3 and 4. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Now Hagar is playing an unwilling part in all of this. She is a slave, and she had to obey her masters. Sarai makes Hagar Abram's wife at the end of verse 3. And we see she's unwilling because when she's pregnant, she had contempt on Sarai. She despised her. And here, like Dennis was saying earlier, the sin of polygamy bears its just ugly head. It is always bound to be the root of envy and jealousy and strife. All three people here are going to be affected by it. Hagar grows contempt and eventually runs away from the problems. Sarai grows angry and mistreats Hagar. Abram avoids the issue and is kind of apathetic. Clearly, polygamy is wrong. God always intended marriage to be between one man and one woman, as he says in Genesis 2. And he reiterates that through Jesus in Matthew 19 and again in Paul in Ephesians 5. Let's just look at these quick. Go to Genesis 2. Genesis 2. Let's start in verse 23. After God makes a woman from the rib of man. Genesis 2, verse 23. Then the man said, This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore, verse 24, Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife are both naked and not ashamed. Jump over to Matthew chapter 19. Matthew 19. Pharisees come to Jesus just in these first 12 verses. Pharisees come to Jesus and ask him, they try to test him, ask him a question. Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? This is Jesus' answer starting in verse 4. Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Where therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. So Jesus is again affirming the same marriage covenant that was instituted all the way back in Genesis. He is repeating the same thing here. Some people today will say that Jesus never addressed things like homosexuality or any number of topics, but I would contend from these verses that he is showing what a marriage should be. It's not a new teaching for him. He's upholding what was already established in the Old Testament. And Paul does the same thing. Go to Ephesians chapter 5. In his teaching on marriage and husbands and wives. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 31. Talking about wives submitting to husbands, husbands loving your wives. Verse 31. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So all three of them are quoting the exact same verse, or all three places are quoting the exact same thing in relation to marriage. Marriage should not be between multiple husbands, multiple wives. Marriage should not be between or be in a homosexual context. It is plain and simple. There's no beating around the bush with this. It's very apparent. So let's come back to Genesis. Again, God's always intended marriage to be between one male and one female. So in verse 5, we see this. Genesis 16, verse 5. Sarai said to Abram, May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." So why did the plan backfire? Why did Sarai's plan backfire? It wasn't God's plan, it was her plan. She got mad. Janice had I think, was the one who said the word earlier. Jealousy rears its ugly head. Once Sarai realized that she didn't like what Abram and Hagar had done, she blames Abram. And like Dennis was saying, it was her idea though. But as we saw with Adam and Eve, this is what sin often does. We blame someone else so that we don't have to deal with our own sin. Sarai is blaming Abram. And in verse 6, Abram just dodges the responsibility. He just shrugs it off. It's Sarai's slave. She can deal with it. But notice that he doesn't call Hagar his wife. Abram did not accept this as a true marriage. And so Sarai deals harshly with Hagar. Again, what is at the root of the problem between Sarai and Hagar, starting with a J? It is jealousy. Hagar fled. Poor Hagar. Taken from her home, made a slave, told to sleep with someone, became pregnant, became angry, treated harshly. This is not a shining moment in Sarai and Abram's life. And in trying to secure the promise of offspring through just their own strength, they lost the fruit of their efforts. Hagar ran away from them. She left them back at square one. If God didn't intervene, that's how it would have ended. But in verse 7, we see that an angel of the Lord meets Hagar. So while Abram and Sarai were just mistreating Hagar, God still cares for her. Abram and Sarai sinned against God and against Hagar, but God has not deserted them. Hagar was by a spring of water on the way, it says, to Shur. Now, Shur was the name given to just this northwest region of the desert of Arabia. Essentially, she was actually on her way back to Egypt. That's why she is found in Shur. Look at verses 8 and 9. The angel said to her, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from? Where are you going? She said, I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. That would be a hard teaching, wouldn't it? If someone's mistreating you and God says, you need to go back. It's not going to be a pleasant reunion, at the very least. Now, the angel also calls Hagar the servant of Sarai. So I think this also shows that the angel and God did not accept Hagar as Abram's wife. This marriage shouldn't have happened, and God was not going to recognize it, just as Abram didn't recognize it. And the angel already knew the answer to the questions he asked, but he encourages her Hagar to go back to Sarai and submit. Again, that would be hard for Hagar to do because Sarai was mistreating her before and would most likely do it again. But then you see in verses 10 through 12 that God told her that she was pregnant with a son who she would call Ishmael. Ishmael means God hears. While Ishmael would not be the heir to the covenant that God made with Abram, he would still be blessed. God promised to multiply Ishmael's descendants and make them to be a great nation. Now it's out of this group, it is out of Ishmael that the Arab people come. And they are fulfilling this prophecy to this day. Their hand is against everyone. The Arab and Israeli conflict that plagues the Middle East today began right here, at this moment. Ishmael here is described as a wild donkey of a man. What a description. It means that he would live in the desert lands, he'd be independent, and he'd probably have a confrontational nature. And again, the Arab nations are also independent people dwelling in desert lands and have a confrontational nature, especially with Israel and her allies. So if you're wondering why the Middle East has never known peace, you can trace it all the way back to Abram and Sarai's actions. To say that Genesis has no bearing on life, faith, or belief today is to ignore truths like this, that the origin comes right here. Middle East has never known peace. Verses 13 and 14. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." For she said, "Truly, here I have seen him who looks after me." Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. So here we see that it is actually Yahweh who is talking to her. Verse 13, she calls on the name of the Lord. The Lord in your translation is most likely all capitalized. That indicates that it is talking about the personal name for God. She says that God sees her. She hasn't felt seen yet, right? She's only felt used. So now Hagar feels cared for by God, especially since he has revealed to her that he is going to work through her and her son and bless them. And the name of the well called Bir Lahai Roi means the well of the one who lives and sees me. That's what it means from the Hebrew. The well of the one who lives and sees me. So God is a personal God who is concerned with abused people like Hagar and with unborn babies, which again, let's thank God that Roe was overturned. And then in verses 15 and 16, Hagar does return and submit herself to Sarai. And in doing so, I think she's trusting God more than Sarai to protect her and her son and to care for them in the years to come. It says that Hagar had Ishmael, and Abram named him Ishmael. In this whole chapter, Abram has kind of had this passive role here. He let Sarai talk him into marrying Hagar. He allowed Sarai to mistreat Hagar and drive her from the camp. And now when Hagar comes back, he names the son Ishmael, I think, out of God's direction, since that's what he said he was going to be named. So out of the three main people in this passage, Abram, Sarai, Hagar, which one do you like the least? That's a hard question, right? It's not a shining moment for any one of them.
Well, I would say Sarah.
Sarai? You too?
Really, she brought this on herself.
Yeah, she brought this on herself.
It wasn't his idea.
Yeah. It wasn't Abram's idea, gracious saying. And it wasn't Hagar's idea either. Yep. I'm repeating exactly what you say for everyone else. Yeah. Yeah. We would have to almost read between the lines here. Either God really impressed on Abram that he should call him Ishmael. Maybe God directly spoke to Abram like he has in the past. Maybe Hagar said to Abram, "Hey, God told me that we're supposed to name him Ishmael." But it was the man's responsibility, their authority to name a newborn, and so it had to be Abram to say officially, "This is who he is." To each of them? Right. Jolene's asking, do we think that God spoke to each of the leaders or each of the main figures in the Bible to have them name their children specific things? And all I will say is the ones that he specifically wanted named something, I think so. Yeah. He wanted Jesus to be named Jesus. He wanted Ishmael and Isaac to be named certain things. I think God spoke to those. For Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. Joseph. I'm not exactly sure that it was specific for them. Janice, did you have a question? It would be Hagar, most likely. I mean, the mother's duty was her own. And for a while, we're going to see this in the future. For a while, we're going to see that they thought that this was the covenant person. Abraham's going to ask God, why can't we do this through Ishmael instead of through this new baby that you're promising still? So they thought that Ishmael was the guy, even though God has never confirmed that. In fact, he said, he'll be made into a great nation. But he never said, hey, you're going to fulfill this covenant here. Would your answer change of Sarai being the least person you like if you knew that it was a common cultural practice in their day for childless couples to include as their own any children that the man made by his servants? Yeah. The what? Yeah, that has happened. Yep. Happens very frequently in the Old Testament. Yep. Because that's, again, it was their culture at the time. What about knowing that Sarai was 75 years old at this time and had always been barren? Yeah. Uh-huh. Right. Yeah, for sure. And I think that also goes to just talk about how it goes to talk about that even if something is accepted in culture, we inherently know things are sin, right? And so we can do something that the culture accepts, and then as soon as it happens, we're like, oh, I do not like that whatsoever. So I think Sarai, to your point, Donna, knew the whole time that this shouldn't happen. But she was kind of, again, just trying to grasp something by her own strength rather than by faith. And so she's like, here's a loophole, let's take it, knowing the full time, like, I'm not going to like it, I don't want to do it, this is wrong, and she does it anyways,
When they said, Hagar looked at her with contempt. Now think about this. She now is pregnant with his child. And she's like, ha.
Yeah.
I'm going to have a baby. You won't.
Yep.
And it's still my baby.
Right. I'm going to try to repeat all that quick. Hagar had a child and had contempt then, or conceived, and then had contempt on Sarai, almost like a, ha, that's my child now, you got what you wanted, I'm getting what I want, type thing. Why do you think God rejected their plan? Miriam. It's not what he had planned. We can easily confuse sometimes our own plans with God's plans, can't we? And we can convince ourselves this is what God wants us to do. And God's like, no, this has no basis in what I want you to do. So the main lesson of this passage, I think this chapter provides a great lesson for God's people. We need to walk by faith and wait for God to fulfill His promises in His way and in His timing. That takes a lot of wisdom and discernment. And as Jesus says in the Gospel of John, we need to abide in Him. The closer we are to Christ in our relationship with Him, we're walking with Him daily, we are most likely, we're going to have a greater knowledge of what He wants us to be doing. The further separate we are, the more we're going to guess. I don't have the mayor. I've met the mayor of George, but I don't have that great of a relationship with him because I've met him twice maybe at a prayer breakfast. I would just guess at whatever question I would ask him, I'd just guess. I'd have no idea what his answer would be. I'd have no idea how to relate to him right now, right? Because we're so separate, even though we're a little bit attached. But if I'm having a close relationship with him, like I do more with you guys, I would have a better idea of how you would respond to things, what you would want in things. I have a greater knowledge because of a better relationship. But in this chapter, we also see the detriments of polygamy and how it leads to envy and jealousy and strife. We see the origins of the perpetual conflict in the Middle East. And lastly, we see that God cares for those who are mistreated. So there are some great lessons still in this chapter, even though it's not a shining moment for any one of them. Are there any other insights that you may have had while we were going through this chapter? Abram still loved that son, very much so. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, when they had the party, we'll see this in a couple chapters, when they had the party for Isaac and Ishmael was sent away, that was very hard on Abram. Yep. Do you have something, Roger? Yeah. Abram's definitely very complacent and apathetic here. Roger was saying that he was getting a pass in all this. That wasn't he the man. He should have taken authority in this, or at least a lead, or something. And yes, he should have, but he didn't. He kind of lets this all happen, and I think that's just another indication that every single step that they were doing, they shouldn't have done. In Genesis 2, Adam is the one who God told, "You shall not eat of this tree." By the time you get to Eve, Eve says, "We can't even touch it." I think that "you can't even touch it" comes from Adam. Okay, God never said that. Eve did. The only middle person was Adam. But Adam should have known better. Even when Eve gave that fruit to him, Adam's like, let's try it out. Abram should have known better. He should have stood up for the truth just as much as Adam should have. And when we don't stand up for the truth, when we don't hold fast to what God has told us, things like this happen. It's another lesson that we can put in there. This is a direct quote from Gracia. She said, "You mean a good husband should not," how'd you say it? "Shouldn't always listen to his wife?" She said it, not me. All right, well, that's all for tonight. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you again soon. Have a good week.